Well, take your Bible and turn over to Mark 13 is where we are. And as you're turning there, I wanted to start out with a question, just thinking about your reading habits. I wonder how many people here this morning frequent the Allen County Public Library system. Right there, I forget how many branches there are in Allen County, but if you are a resident of Allen County, you can obtain a library card for free. I think if you're not a resident, you can also get one, but you have to pay for that. I can remember growing up, my mom would take my brother and I, we'd go, we lived far enough out that there weren't any branches close to us. The closest would be now the DuPont branch, but that wasn't there. And so they had, at that time, the bookmobile. So the bookmobile would make its way out on Carroll Road and stop just west of Carroll High School, and we'd go and pick up books fairly often. I don't remember how frequently, but fairly often. And it was always exciting to go there and pick out a book. There were several books to read. I love to read, and mainly in the summer, obviously, not during the school year, but so as I was thinking about that and just thinking about our passage, thinking about the process as we go to the library today, you go and you check out a book. You keep it for roughly 3 weeks. I think that's how long normally that you're able to keep it before you either have to return it or renew it or pay a fine. Right? Those are kind of the three things that you know. And the possibility of a fine is meant there to encourage return or renewal of the book. So when we check out any book, we know the prediction for the future. Right, the prediction for the future is that either you're going to return it, or you're going to renew it, or you're going to pay the fine. And the fine there is meant to prompt faithfulness to either read the book or to bring it back within the time remaining. Our title for our message this morning is Be on the Alert. Be on the alert, and Jesus is giving us predictions about the future that is meant to prompt faithfulness in the present. Right, to be accomplishing what His will is for us during these however long it is before He returns, however long He gives us in terms of our life here on earth. So as we look at this passage, again, returning to Mark chapter 13, I want us to again be reminded of the statement that I provided last week, and just thinking about what's the main point that Mark is trying to convey, and I think it's this: predictions about the future must fuel our faithfulness in the present, which should then prompt a commitment to ongoing action on our part. Jesus is expressing this truth to us for a purpose. And that purpose is certainly that we would know the future, but I think it's also meant to prompt faithfulness in the present. And so let me ask you to join me in standing as I read the passage that we'll be looking at. I'm going to include some other verses as well before it, just to provide some exclamations. So stand with me. I'm going to read starting in verse 14 here in Mark chapter 13. Mark writes, "But when you see the abomination," here Jesus speaking, "of desolation standing where it should not be," let the reader understand, "then those who are in Judea must flee to the mountains. The one who is on the housetop must not go down or go in to get anything out of his house, and the one who is in the field must not turn back to get his coat. But woe to those who are pregnant and to those who are nursing babies in those days. But pray that it may not happen in the winter, for those days will be a time of tribulation, such as has not occurred since the beginning of the creation, which God created until now and never will." Verse 20, "Unless the Lord had shortened those days, no life would have been safe, but for the sake of the elect whom He chose, He shortened the days. And then if anyone says to you, 'Behold, here is the Christ,' or 'Behold, He is there,' do not believe him. For false Christs and false prophets will arise and will show signs and wonders in order to lead astray, if possible, the elect. But take heed, behold, I have told you everything in advance." Verse 24, "But in those days, after that tribulation, the sun will be darkened and the moon will not give its light. And the stars will be falling from heaven and the powers that are in the heavens will be shaken. Then they will see the Son of Man coming in clouds with great power and glory. And then He will send forth the angels and will gather together His elect from the four winds, from the farthest end of the earth to the farthest end of heaven. Now learn the parable from the fig tree, which its branch has already become tender and put forth its leaves. When that happens, you know that summer is near. Even so, you too, when you see these things happening, recognize that He is near, right at the door. Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. But of that day or hour no one knows, not even the angels in heaven, nor the Son, but the Father alone. Take heed, keep on the alert, for you do not know when the appointed time will come. It is like a man away on a journey, who, upon leaving his house and putting his slaves in charge, assigning to each one his task, also commanded the doorkeeper to stay on the alert. Therefore, be on the alert, for you do not know when the master of the house is coming, whether in the evening, at midnight, or when the rooster crows, or in the morning, in case he should come suddenly and find you asleep. What I say to you, I say to all, be on the alert. Well, join me in praying as we ask God's blessing upon our time. Lord, as we read these predictions of the future, as we consider their truth and application, Lord, I pray you would go before us and just provide the insight we need, the clarity of thought, Lord, the ability to process and to apply. We cry out to you, Lord, not just today, but every day, that you would help us to be living in active submission to your will for us, as expressed and provided to us through your word. So we just thank you for this morning. In Jesus' name, amen. You may be seated. Well, look at these verses, starting in verse 14. I'm wanting to provide for us really the bigger picture, the big picture perspective on what Mark is saying in chapter 13. At the beginning of this chapter, we saw Jesus leaving. We see him leaving the temple for the final time, which, if in your mind you're thinking of his last week on earth, Mark presents for us in chapters 11 through 16. So this would have been taking place as he leaves the temple on Wednesday of the final week of his life prior to his crucifixion. On Thursday night, Jesus will spend what we know to be the Last Supper with his disciples in the upper room. He will enjoy the Passover meal with them. He will establish communion as we know it today, and he will wash the disciples' feet. He is then arrested late Thursday night after Judas's betrayal, and on Friday he is tried and crucified. So we come back to our passage here in these verses at the beginning of Mark 13. On Wednesday, and as Jesus leaves the temple, the unknown disciple, as Mark tells us, comes to Jesus and comments on the beauty of the temple, just how amazing it looks. And this temple, again, Herod has spent several decades at this point refurbishing. But in response to this, we see Jesus' amazing words that prophesied its destruction, which we know took place roughly 40 years later in AD 70 at the hands of Titus, the Roman general. So Jesus uses this judgment on Jerusalem and Israel really as a springboard to go on and speak of the judgment that will fall upon the whole world that will lead to his return. So in light of that, we need to remember that the expectation of each of these disciples who were there with him, these Jewish disciples, was one that Jesus, as he's now made his way to Jerusalem, that he would usher in his kingdom, right? That he would begin to rule and reign as what they know, what the Old Testament described in terms of the Messiah. But the predictions that they had struggled, that they were continuing to struggle over, was the prediction that Jesus gave in terms of what treatment he would receive once he made it to Jerusalem. That he would be arrested, rejected, and crucified and die. I mean, that did not fit at all with their paradigm of how things were supposed to unfold, especially this prediction about his death and him talking about rising from the dead. So as he leaves the temple, Jesus makes his way up the Mount of Olives, Mark tells us, and he stops to take the time to outline for them what they should expect to happen in the future now, in light of the fact that they have this misunderstanding of what's going to take place of when his kingdom is going to be ushered in. So he provides some explanation for these future events in relationship to where they are now and when he will come back. We noted last week that in verses 5 through 13, Jesus shares with them what going forward will entail. And we noted that, if you're following your bulletin there, deception and persecution were two things that really marked these final days, these last days that began after Jesus' death and resurrection. And so we've seen in the near-term fulfillment of these words with the disciples that they also experienced this great persecution. And as we look at history, we know over the last 2,000 years as well that has been the case for most believers. If you've seen in the news recently, we know a pastor in Turkey named Andrew Brunson, who had lived in Turkey for the past 23 years, pastoring an evangelical church called Resurrection Church. He was arrested in 2016 when he was applying for a permanent residency. He was detained, and what happened is he was doing this in the middle of the failed coup that took place. And so in light of that, they were trying to sweep up all the people that they thought were involved, and as a result, he was one of the people arrested. They were making the charge that he was having links to a Muslim political party that the government alleges led the coup. So during his incarceration, he hasn't had his trial until last week it began. He's lost over 50 pounds, had a bit of a psychological breakdown. But here, the U.S. is seeking to gain his release. But what do we see here? Well, undoubtedly, there's deception, right? I mean, is this pastor really trying to overthrow the government in Turkey? I highly doubt it. He says he's not. right? There's deception, there's persecution. He's involved and he's been returned now. His trial is on pause for about a month. He's returned to the first prison he was in that is a very difficult. So you pray for him. Andrew Brunson is his name, that God would sustain him. But as we think about our own country, as we think about deception and persecution that are continuing and will continue as our country continues to move in a secular direction, forsaking biblical truth, and we see really, and we will continue to see, Christianity viewed now in many ways as a bigoted religion. And the reason why I say that is because of our refusal to accept sins as being commonplace and as what would characterize a right view of life, whether that's homosexuality, you fill in the blank of other sins, whether it's gender identity blending, all types of things that our culture is promoting now that we are saying we don't think that's what God would have us do. And so the response by the culture is going to be a continued marginalization of Christianity. So Jesus says, be on guard, verse 9, that that's what's coming. And other brothers and sisters around the world are already experiencing those things. But we know that when we stand before the courts, like Pastor Bronson did last week, the Holy Spirit promises He'll give us the words to say. It's from that we take great hope. But as we continue, Jesus continues after verse 13, then we see Him, as He starts in verse 14, He shares that a great tribulation is coming. There's a picture of Pastor Brunson. A great tribulation is coming, and we see that being described now starting in verse 14. Because up to this point, what we see happening here is this persecution being experienced in these last days is certainly difficult, but it's not every person is experiencing it in the same way. Right? Not every Christian will experience the same level of difficulty. But as Jesus continues now in verse 14, we see Him describing the arrival of a sign that will make known to all who have ears to hear and eyes to see that a new phase in the end times has arrived. And so we're called to make note of this sign. What He says in verse 14, but when you see the abomination of desolation standing where it should not be, let the reader understand. Now again, here Mark inserts for only the second time in his gospel a comment that's directly from him. And he's saying here, Jesus is speaking. In the middle of this, Mark says, let the reader understand. So we have to ask the question, why is he doing this? I think the reason why Mark is doing this is to help his readers see that the information that Jesus is going to share now is information that they will need to pay attention to. And the reason for that is because the people that Jesus is speaking to primarily here, as he spoke these words, it wasn't something that they were going to see in their lifetime. Instead, Mark is now saying, let the reader understand, because those who are going to read this gospel going forward, someday those people will need to know what is going to be explained now by Jesus. When this sign happens, but when you see the abomination of desolation. And this sign, this abomination of desolation, according to verse 19, it marks the beginning of a time which will lead to a period of tribulation on the earth that will be unmatched in human history. We see that in verse 19 where he says, for those days will be a time of tribulation such as has not occurred since the beginning of the creation which God created until now and never will. Unless the Lord had shortened those days, no life would have been saved. But for the sake of the elect whom He chose, He shortened the days. So here, as Jesus is expressing this truth about a future time of tribulation, He mentions the fact that the Lord shortens these days. We have to flip back to the Old Testament to gain some further understanding, because the prophet Daniel helps us to make sense of what's happening here, of what's taking place through the revelation that he received in chapter 9 of his book, in the book of Daniel. And Daniel writes this, 70 weeks have been decreed for your people and your holy city to finish the transgression. This is the angel speaking to Daniel. To make an end of sin, to make atonement for iniquity, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal up vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy place. So you are to know and discern that from the issuing of a decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem until Messiah, the Prince, there will be 7 weeks and 72 weeks. It will be built again with plaza and moat until in times of distress. Then after the 62 weeks, the Messiah will be cut off and have nothing, and the people of the Prince who is to come will destroy the city and the sanctuary. And its end will come with a flood. Even to the end there will be war. Desolations are determined. Now, I believe there's many interpretations of this, but I think what Pastor John MacArthur writes, I think he rightly interprets the information to mean the following, that there are 69 weeks of Daniel's history from the decree of Artaxerxes to rebuild Jerusalem to the coming of Messiah. He writes, you can track those 69 times 7 years, and you'll end up with Jesus coming to Jerusalem during this week. End quote. So if we start with the decree that Artaxerxes made, that he gives to rebuild Jerusalem and continue to Jesus' arrival in Jerusalem, we see Daniel's prophecy being fulfilled in Jesus' day, because with his crucifixion, he certainly is cut off. He is removed from the scene. Verse 26 ties in with what Jesus describes here in Mark through verses 5 through 13 of what's happening. That then leads us to verse 14, where in Mark, what we just read about the desolation of this desolation that's going to happen. And verse 27 of Daniel chapter 9. The abomination of desolation happens, which is tied, as we saw last week in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, with the coming of the Antichrist. It is the Antichrist that Daniel now makes reference to in verse 27. Verse 27 says this, "And he will make a firm covenant with the many for 1 week, but in the middle of the week he will put a stop to sacrifice and grain offering, and on the wing of abominations will come one who makes desolate, even until a complete destruction. One that is decreed is poured out on the one who makes desolate." So here, as we look at these verses, as we see Daniel writing, I like how Pastor MacArthur again explains this. He says these are actual 7-year periods. That 70th week, therefore, must also be a 7-year period. In fact, halfway through that period comes the Great Tribulation, which I think Jesus is making reference to here. And the last 3.5 is the worst of all. The Bible refers to it as the 3.5 period. Daniel called it time, times, and half a time. So all of these add up to 3.5 years. So within this great tribulation, the latter 3.5 years are so brutal that God must shorten the time in which this activity is taking place. And we see Daniel echoing this at the end of his book in chapter 12, of this being shortened, or rather the time period of this. He says, starting in verse 11, "From the time that the regular sacrifice is abolished and the abomination of desolation is set up, there will be 1,290 days. How blessed is he who keeps waiting and attains to the 1,335 days." So this great tribulation that Jesus is describing here in Mark 13, it's shortened in total. Daniel is making reference to this 3.5 years of the tribulation is extremely severe. And we see that much of this is detailed for us in chapters 6 through 19 of the book of Revelation. Those chapters are detailing what's happening on earth during this time of unmatched upheaval and judgment. And so, as in our church, we would hold to the doctrine that the church is actually raptured out of this before this tribulation happens. Many have differing views on that, but as we see this taking place, we see certainly that as Jesus is describing these events in Mark 13, certainly there is a great tribulation that's going to take place. And I want you to know with me the response that Jesus calls for as this tribulation begins. Look with me starting in verse 15. Where we're to make note of the response. "The one who is on the housetop must not go down or go in to get anything out of his house, and the one who is in the field must not turn back to get his coat. But woe to those who are pregnant and to those who are nursing babies in those days, but pray that it may not happen in the winter." It's interesting here, as we noted last week, these people are told to flee as this tribulation begins, as this abomination of desolation happens, as this comes, as the Antichrist comes. And those who would have come to faith during this period after the church is raptured out, these are people who come to faith in him, and they're told to flee. They're told not to stay. They're told not to evangelize. They're told to flee during this period, I think because of the greatness of this tribulation that they will endure, which is then followed by what we read in verse 24. Verse 24, "But in those days, after that tribulation," so after this tribulation has taken place, we see then Jesus describing what's going to happen leading up to his return. "The sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will be falling from heaven, and the powers that are in the heavens will be shaken. Then they will see the Son of Man coming in clouds with great power and glory, and then he will send forth the angels and will gather together his elect from the four winds, from the farthest end of the earth to the farthest end of heaven." So this is some amazing stuff to think about. This is Jesus telling us what's going to happen once this tribulation is over. After that 3.5-year period of the most severe tribulation is over, we're going to see the events that will happen. And this is what I want you to see, to be encouraged by God's protection of his people at Jesus' coming. And one of the encouragements is the signs that will mark his return. And we see these here, which are pretty amazing. The sun will be darkened. The moon will not give its light. The stars will be falling from heaven, and the powers that are in the heavens will be shaken. Here Jesus describes for us what these events will look like. And he tells us that the light given off from the sun will cease. I don't know exactly how that's going to work, but here's what the Bible tells us. The sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, right? The moon reflects the light of the sun, so if its light is diminished or turned off in some way, the moon certainly cannot reflect anything if there isn't any light for it to reflect. The stars will be falling from heaven, and the powers that are in the heavens will be shaken. Do I know what that means? I don't know exactly what that means, but I do know it would be terrifying. As you think about what the powers that are in the heavens be shaken, what does that look like? Well, it's certainly pretty significant. Now, it's interesting to note that as Jesus expresses this to these 4 disciples who were there, we know from the beginning as Mark is writing who asked the question, this wouldn't have been new information for them. And I say that because of what we see in the book of Isaiah. In Isaiah chapter 6, Isaiah writes this, "Wail, for the day of the Lord is near." Right, the coming of the Lord. It will come as destruction from the Almighty. Therefore all hands will fall limp, and every man's heart will melt. They will be terrified. Pains and anguish will take hold of them. They will writhe like a woman in labor. They will look at one another in astonishment, their faces aflame. Now you can't just stop and think about, if the sun is dark and the moon isn't shining, if all the stars are falling, all these things are happening, that would probably reflect, you'd be terrorized, wouldn't you? I mean, you look at each other, you'd be totally in astonishment. Verse 9, "Behold, the day of the Lord is coming, cruel with fury and burning anger, to make the land a desolation, and he will exterminate its sinners from it. For the stars of heaven and their constellations will not flash forth their light. The sun will be dark when it rises, and the moon will not shed its light. Thus I will punish the world for its evil, and the wicked for their iniquity. I will also put an end to the arrogance of the proud, and abase the haughtiness of the ruthless. I will make mortal man scarcer than pure gold, and mankind than the gold of Ophir. Therefore I will make the heavens tremble, and the earth will be shaken from its place at the fury of the Lord of hosts in the day of his burning anger." It's pretty significant as we read these words and think about the terror that would fill us if we were on the earth at that time. I mean, just looking at verse 13 of the earth will be shaken from its place. Maybe it's out of orbit in some way. I mean, I don't know. But whatever it is, it's going to be a time of great terror as God is pouring out his judgment upon the earth for the sin that's happened. But I want you to note that in the midst of this, how does God care for his people? Well, we look and see that through the activity of the angels when he comes. Look at verse 27. "And then he will send forth the angels and will gather together his elect from the 4 winds, from the farthest end of the earth to the farthest end of heaven." Here we see Jesus describing God's faithfulness to protect his people. Those who will survive this great tribulation, who will come to faith during that time and are brought, they are gathered, Jesus describes here. They are gathered from the 4 winds, from the 4 corners of the globe. And what a relief this will be for them. That they will, along with those who will return with Christ, will then populate the earth as Jesus rules over it for 1,000 years. Which then leads us to our next set of verses. We'll come to some application in a few minutes here, but just looking at this as Jesus is expressing this information of what's happening. Verse 28, "Now learn the parable from the fig tree. When its branch has already become tender and puts forth its leaves, you know that summer is near. Even so, you too, when you see these things happening, recognize that he is near, right at the door. Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place." So here as Jesus is speaking, I ask the question, how does Jesus want us to live in light of these truths? As we look at this, and certainly as we look at these verses, Jesus is recording them for those who will be alive when the tribulation is about to begin. First thing I think we need to see is we're called to trust Jesus' words. Trust his words. And Jesus here is using this parable of the fig tree. Now, hopefully, if you've been with us, you're reminded of the parable that he gave, or the illustration he gave of the fig tree when he was going back and forth to the temple. And he cursed the fig tree. But I don't think he's making a direct reference to that example. Instead, I think what he is doing here, he's making a reference to what these disciples would have seen and what we see today when the trees around us begin to emerge from their hibernation of the winter. I mean, you look around us, many of the trees now are beginning, some of them are budding. Others are producing sap, right, to signal again and reflect the fact that the tree is preparing itself for the summer growth. And so just as the trees, Jesus is saying, pay attention to the parable, just as the trees begin to go through these physical changes, which signal a coming of summer, so too those believers who will be present when these changes start happening, starting in verse 14, they should take comfort in knowing that Jesus is so very near. Right? The end is coming. He is near. Jesus says that he is so near that he says that this generation that's on the earth at that time, when they see this first sign in verse 14 take place, they're comforted by the fact that their generation will not pass away before all these things are fulfilled, that Jesus will be coming back. And so in verse 31, we are reminded that no matter how untrustworthy and fragile are the things of this world, which cannot be trusted, that Jesus' words can be trusted. Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. And he reminds them then, verse 31, heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. Certainly in the midst of this, they're going to be scared, they're going to be terrified, but they are reminded, Mark says, pay attention, don't forget what Jesus is saying here, that he is still faithful. He will sustain them. So, verse 32, but of that day or hour no one knows, not even the angels in heaven nor the Son, but the Father alone. This is oftentimes causes concern, because if Jesus is God, well then how can he say that he doesn't know the end? Like here again, in this, we have to recognize that, and a lot of times the cults fail to recognize this, that here Jesus is speaking from the perspective of his humanity. Because he was fully divine, but he also was fully human, or is fully human and fully divine. And so as his humanity was veiling his deity, he could say in his humanity that he did not know the date of his coming. So, as we look at this, again, date setting. I mentioned last week about somebody that was going to say the rapture was going to happen tomorrow. Again, nowhere do we know the sign of when that will come. There is no sign that has to take place. We've seen the signs now in this passage of when Jesus will come back, but we don't know the rapture, so it could be tomorrow. It might not be. It probably isn't going to be, since somebody's already prophesied that it will be. But certainly we can trust in the fact that Jesus' words are the ones that we need to look to. And so in light of that, verse 33, he says, take heed, keep on the alert, for you do not know when the appointed time will come. Here again, he's speaking to these disciples and to us. It's like a man away on a journey who, upon leaving his house and putting his slaves in charge, he tells them to be ready. Jesus uses that as an example. They're to be on the alert, for they don't know when their master will return. And Jesus doesn't want them to be found unexpected. Whoops. Pause here. Unexpected of when that will happen. And so our challenge is we are to remain alert to fulfill God's mission for our lives. Jesus uses this example again of someone going away and you being left in charge. And so the question as we sit here today, are we experiencing the deception and persecution that Jesus described? Certainly. We know that the great tribulation is coming. But the question I want us to consider is, how alert are we? How alert are we? And does this truth prompt in us a greater worship of the Lord? Right? He hasn't left us unaware. He has provided this information for us, not to be fearful, but to be thankful. To recognize that this glorious God is coming back. He will return one day. And it should prompt faithfulness in our minds as we think about the challenge that we all face. If you were here 2 weeks ago when Todd France preached from the book of Revelation in chapters 2 and 3, and just thinking about how easily we can be lulled to sleep. Think about your daily routine. How often do you think about the fact that the Lord will return one day and we will give an account? If you're a believer, not for whether or not you'll get into heaven, but really as a reflection of how you are seeking to live your life in obedience to what God has called you to do. We can be lulled to sleep in thinking that these secondary priorities take precedence over what God has called us to do. Am I seeking to live through my job as a means to glorify the Lord? Am I seeking in the way that I parent my children, the way that I do my schoolwork, the way that I live in my neighborhood, having a desire to want to see people come to know Christ? This is in here for a reason. Because we need to be reminded that like the church at Laodicea, we can become hardened in our hearts. We can be lulled to sleep and failing to recognize that things will not continue on as they are. What Isaiah says will happen. What Jesus is describing here will take place. And so, is there not a sense of weightiness and gravity as we think about the reality of those who are far from God? The judgment that will fall. Is there an awakening desire in your heart to be praying, to be investing, to be inviting in those who are far from God? To be seeking the Lord's face that He might draw them to Himself. And if we meditate long on this, hopefully it brings us to tears. To recognize that that's what we deserve apart from Christ. That all the things, when we come to the place when we stand before God and He says, "What did you do with the time that I gave you?" That we'll be broken. We know the Lord is the one who saves, but ultimately He saves. But there is a sense where we are called to be about that work of living out our faith, of sharing the gospel. I think as well of just seeking to encourage the hearts of those in the body as well. Being alert means we're encouraging one another to be alert. Of spending time with one another, of investing in the lives of each other. Pastor Brandon mentioned, as we have time after the service ends and before it, to be fellowshipping with one another, to be encouraging one another in the work that God is doing in our lives. I need that, and so do you. And not just on Sunday, but during the week, engaging one another so that we might be reminded of what God has called us to do. That we're not doing this alone, we're called to do it together. So as we close this morning, just again, the challenge to be on the alert. If you have a bulletin, in your bulletin, there is a response card that you can pull out now and just be thinking about as you consider how God might be calling you to respond. On the front of if you're visiting, you can put your name and address and either drop it off at the Welcome Center where they can give you a gift, or we'll send you one in the mail if you drop it in the offering plate. On the back of the card, it has some suggested ways that you can respond, commit yourself to responding. And really, this is a means for you to allow me to pray for you. Right? You're the one who has to respond. I'm simply, you're communicating this to me to be able to pray for you. First is this: I confess that I've not remained alert and obedient to God's mission for me as His follower. Pray that God's Spirit would use His Word to ignite a greater passion and joy in following Jesus. Whether that begins, if we're going to be communicating the truth of the gospel, we need to be challenged and certainly encouraged by that in our own walk with God. Secondly, pray for me that my trust in Jesus' words would lead me to greater faithfulness in praying, investing, and inviting those far from God to know Him through faith in Jesus. Right, we're not saved by our good works. We're not saved by coming to church regularly, being baptized. None of those things save. It's only faith in what Jesus Christ did on the cross. Trusting in that substitute who bore my sin in my place, that I might know His forgiveness and receive His righteousness. Lastly, please contact me, as I know that I am far from God, but He is working in me, and I have questions about how I can know forgiveness for my sins. Maybe you're here this morning and really, God is beginning to do this work and opening your eyes to the reality of your need of Him. Now, I challenge you. This would provide you an opportunity to just check that circle and drop it in the offering plate. I'm not asking you to walk forward, but simply providing an opportunity to engage in conversation at another time, to talk seriously about spiritual things. We know the Lord is coming. And again, the challenge with this truth is that predictions about the future must fuel our faithfulness in the present. A faithfulness that is lived out in our daily activity, in a resorting of our priorities, no matter our age, that we might seek to be used by Him.